Many companies are going to have an employee handbook or policy manual that addresses many topics beyond the few that are listed on this slide, but these are written policies that are currently required under New York law, with a couple exceptions that I have a little asterisk by on this slide, which I'll explain. New York requires a written sexual harassment policy. So whether you have one employee or 1,000 employees in New York State, you need to have a written sexual harassment policy and provide that to the employee, as well as conduct annual sexual harassment training for all employees. Remember, this includes your remote employees. Don't leave them out. Paid family leave, again, we talked about you have to have that coverage. The law does require that there be a written paid family leave policy, in essence, with certain minimum topics addressed. Electronic monitoring and vacation, I have an asterisk by. These are not absolutely required to be in writing, but if you want to do certain things, you have to put it in writing. I'll get back to the electronic monitoring in just a minute. For vacation, the key point here is you should have any vacation or PTO or leave benefit in writing if you're going to offer them, especially if you are going to put a provision in place, for example, that says that no vacation will carry over from year to year, or that there will be no cash out of PTO at the end of employment, for example, where I'm using vacation and PTO interchangeably. Any of these leave types of policies, if you don't want to have to pay them out, you don't want to carry them over, and you want to put any other restrictions on them, you're allowed to do so generally, but it has to be in writing. If it's not in writing and an employee complains, you will lose. The Airborne Infectious Disease Exposure Prevention Plan is a new requirement arising out of COVID under the New York HERO Act. Ironically, the Airborne Infectious Disease Exposure Prevention Plan isn't limited to COVID. It is really designed to be in place in case there is a future outbreak of some disease, but right after the new requirement to have such a plan went into effect last year, COVID was in fact then designated as such a disease that required employers to put the plan into action. That designation is now lifted, so you're not required to have this plan in effect. But if you have an employee in New York, you are expected to have an airborne infectious disease exposure prevention plan and give it to the employee. For remote employees in particular, I've had plenty of questions about, do we have to somehow address employees working from home in our airborne infectious disease exposure prevention plan? There's nothing in the guidelines for the plans that addresses that very specifically. I think the biggest issue is having a plan generally for your physical workplaces, but I guess if you don't have any physical workplaces in New York, you would have to consider how you're going to comply with the potential obligation to have the plan, notwithstanding the fact that all your workplaces are employees' homes or other locations, except that I point out that the law does make it clear that employers only have to include mechanisms to make safe their controlled premises. So it's clear that you don't have to have measures in place for employees' homes, but it's also clear that you're supposed to have the plan even if you only have one employee in New York State. That requirement doesn't apply to government employers.